In the summer of 1665, England was unravelling. Church bells tolled endlessly for the dead. Red crosses were painted on doors. Entire streets fell silent as families barricaded themselves indoors, hoping hunger would arrive later than disease. The Great Plague of London had returned with terrifying force, killing tens of thousands and paralysing daily life. Universities closed. Commerce stalled. The future felt suspended, as if time itself had contracted. And yet, in a quiet rural village far from the city's chaos, a single young man entered what would become the most productive quarantine in human history. His name was Isaac Newton. He was 22 years old, largely unknown, and officially unemployed, sent home from Cambridge University when it shut its doors to escape the plague. What followed over the next 18 months would not merely occupy his time. It would reshape science forever. A world in retreat when the plague surged through England, it spared no social class. The wealthy fled cities. The poor were sealed inside them. Fear became policy. Cambridge, like Oxford and London, closed its colleges. Students were dismissed indefinitely, their studies postponed until the disease burned itself out. For most, this interruption was catastrophic. Careers stalled. Knowledge stagnated. Years were lost. For Newton, it was liberation. He returned to his childhood home, Woolsthorpe Manor in Lincolnshire, a modest farmhouse surrounded by fields, orchards, and open sky. There were no laboratories, no libraries beyond what he carried with him, no professors to guide or correct him, no deadlines, only silence. The solitude of a dangerous mind. Newton was not a social prodigy. Even by the standards of his time, he was withdrawn, intense, and obsessive. He struggled with authority, mistrusted peers, and worked in secret whenever possible. At Cambridge, he had been a capable but unremarkable student, constrained by rigid curricula and Aristotelian dogma. Quarantine removed those constraints. With the world slowed to a crawl, Newton worked according to his own rhythms, sleeping irregularly, eating little, thinking constantly. He filled notebooks with calculations, diagrams, and questions. Without realizing it, he entered what later historians would call his annus mirabilis, his miracle years. In isolation, he did not review old knowledge. He rebuilt it from first principles. Inventing calculus in the countryside, one of Newton's first breakthroughs during quarantine, was mathematical and astonishing. At the time, there was no systematic method for analyzing continuous change. Problems involving motion, curves, and rates of change were awkward, fragmented, and incomplete. Newton solved this by inventing an entirely new branch of mathematics, calculus. Working alone, he developed techniques to calculate instantaneous rates of change and areas under curves. He called his method the method of fluxions, imagining quantities flowing through time. This framework allowed him to describe motion not as a series of steps, but as a continuous process. He did not publish it. He barely told anyone. Yet this silent invention would later become the mathematical backbone of physics, engineering, economics, and modern science itself. Light in a dark year confined to Woolsthorpe, Newton also turned his attention to light. At the time, light was poorly understood, believed by many to be a simple, pure phenomenon. Color was thought to arise from impurities or distortions. Newton suspected otherwise. Using a prism he had brought with him, he conducted experiments in his darkened room, carefully passing sunlight through glass and observing the spectrum that emerged. He discovered that white light was not pure at all. It was a mixture of colors. Color was intrinsic, not accidental. This insight overturned centuries of assumptions. From these experiments came the foundations of modern optics, the understanding of refraction, dispersion, and the nature of light itself. It would eventually lead to telescopes, microscopes, and technologies Newton could never have imagined. All of it began in a quarantined farmhouse while plague carts rolled through distant towns. The apple and the question no one asked it was also during this period that Newton began thinking deeply about gravity. The famous apple story, often mocked or oversimplified, has a kernel of truth. Whether or not an apple actually struck him, Newton did observe one falling. But the genius was not the observation. It was the question. Why should the same force that pulls an apple to the ground not also reach the moon? This was a radical leap. No one had seriously proposed that terrestrial and celestial motion were governed by the same laws. The heavens were thought to be perfect, separate, divine. Newton dared to unify them. Using his newly invented mathematics, he began calculating whether a force diminishing with distance could explain both falling objects and planetary orbits. The numbers worked. Gravity, he realized, was universal. A private revolution. What makes this period so extraordinary is not just the number of breakthroughs, but their concentration. In roughly 18 months, Newton laid the groundwork for calculus, classical mechanics, universal gravitation. The science of optics. Any one of these achievements would have secured a place in history. Together, they redefined it. And yet, at the time, almost no one knew. Newton did not rush to publish. He was cautious, secretive, even paranoid about criticism. His ideas remained mostly in notebooks, sketches, and private letters. The world was too busy surviving the plague to notice what was being born in isolation. Why quarantine worked. It is tempting to romanticize Newton's quarantine as proof that isolation breeds genius. But the truth is more complex. Newton succeeded not because he was isolated, but because he had the rare combination of preparation, temperament, and timing. Years of study had primed his mind. The absence of external pressure allowed deep focus. The crisis stripped away distractions. Most people in quarantine suffered. Newton thrived because his mind was already dangerous to the status quo. Isolation did not create his brilliance. It unleashed it. The cost of obsession. It is important not to turn Newton into a myth without shadows. His later life was marked by conflict, bitterness, and emotional instability. He feuded with rivals, delayed publications out of fear, and struggled with paranoia. The same intensity that powered his miracle years also isolated him from others. Progress, in this case, came at a human cost. When the world reopened, when the plague finally subsided and Cambridge reopened, Newton returned, not as a student, but as a transformed mind. Over the following decades, he would formalize, refine, and eventually publish his ideas, most famously in Philosophiae Naturalis Principia Mathematica. That book would change everything. It described a universe governed by mathematical laws, predictable and unified. It marked the beginning of modern physics, and its intellectual DNA traced directly back to the quiet months of quarantine at Woolsthorpe. A lesson across centuries. The most productive quarantine in history did not look productive at the time. No accolades, no audience, no recognition. Just one mind, thinking deeply while the world burned. History often moves this way. While societies focus on survival, transformation happens quietly, offstage, in places where time slows enough for ideas to take root. Newton's plague years remind us that interruption is not always loss. Sometimes it is a clearing, a brutal, unchosen pause that allows something new to emerge. The world stopped in 1665. Science did not. And when the bells finally stopped tolling, humanity stepped into a universe it had never known before, one shaped by a young man who, in the darkest of times, found light by thinking alone.